So, part 5, Maverick Physical Therapy of our first case study, which involves my dad. And so, where we left off, we're now kind of first part of May, middle of May or so. My dad getting into big time now into the preparation of the land for planting all of his vegetables, and a lot of the work that he does in the orchards and stuff like that. Continued to have, which was progressively getting worse, the tingling, the numbness, the throbbing night pains, and continuing now to go back and forth with neurologists, orthopedic surgeons, primary care physician in terms of, hey, what's actually going on? And I continue to say, hey, Dad, just come out for a weekend, even if it's a day. Let me get my hands on you. You're not presenting with what they think that you have. This is not making sense. And so in the first to middle part of July, I headed back to Michigan. Gift, postdoctorate fellowship program in applied functional science, was headed on back there, and I had worked that whole day, flew out of San Diego, flew into Detroit. From Detroit, I'm looking at a 3.5 to 4 hour drive home. Well, I flew in, I didn't get in until the time I got my rental car. It was about 2 o'clock a.m. When I landed in Detroit, it was around 12:50 or 1 by the time I got bags, etc. and stuff like that. It was late. Headed on up, jammed on up, got there in about 3.5 hours. So I was there by about 6 o'clock a.m. Got a little bit of sleep. That morning he was having just an annual checkup with his primary care physician, as a physical. Slept for a couple hours and got up. Started in working on my dad. Started in kind of asking some questions, asking more about symptoms, changes, exacerbating factors, alleviating factors, and how this has been playing out over the course of the last few months now. Again, this is the middle of July, or early part of July 2015. Started in the exam and the evaluation process, and my big thing is, you know what, I'm not going to just kind of chip away, go for some singles. I want to go for some home runs. I want to try and just knock some things out of the park. I'm kind of at a time crunch and stuff like that. This morning, what I want to do is I want to reproduce his symptoms with movement, and I want to be able to take them away with movement so that I know that he's within my scope of practice in terms of treatment. So taking this hypothesis of what I had before, Dad, you have cancer, prove to me you don't have that, prove me wrong. Well, I went straight after, okay, if you have all this stuff going on, I know 100% that I will reproduce this stuff with motion that we're creating throughout the cervical spine. So I started with a cervical spine kind of lunge matrix to be able to take the cervical spine through flexion and extension. I know if there's some form of cervical radiculopathy going on, and a significant amount of degenerative changes in arthropathy, spondylitis, degenerative joint disease, degenerative disc disease, whatever you want to call an accumulation of all these things with osteophyte formation, or just a ton of tissue that is formed through fibroblastic activity with a massive amount of collagen laying down more tissue. If I'm running short of space and stuff like that, in which those neuroforamina and potentially the spinal cord going through the vertebral foramen is getting closed on up, I'm going to be able to reproduce all that stuff going through extension. And then we went through some frontal plane stuff. We went through a little frontal plane pendulum swing so that I can get relative motion, so driving the thoracic spine, in which I'm heading on up to the cervical then. Indirectly, I'm getting some right and some left side bend if I fixate my gaze and I don't, let's say, move the head per se. So I went with a fixated gaze first, and then I went with some same side, opposite side rotational lunges with a dowel. So a little 3D pendulum swing in the transverse plane with a fixated head first. And then we started to get a little bit more aggressive with that. So I started to actually, instead of fixate the head, started moving the head in the opposite direction that my thoracic spine was going, so that I could here thoracic spine extension, get cervical spine flexion. Here on the way back, if I am taking my thoracic spine into flexion, and I'm maybe gazing up or taking my head up to get extension, I'm closing all that stuff down. Same thing with my neuroforamina right and left now. So if I go with a little right lateral lunge with a lateral pendulum swing, thoracic spine is bending, is flexing to the left, which is closing up and giving me some right-sided flexion throughout the cervical spine, closing up those neuroforamina. And then the same thing with the left. And if I start to go with a transverse plane, a posterior lateral, a rotational or same side rotational lunge, fixate my gaze straight ahead or even rotate it to the left, thoracic spine is rotated right, cervical spine is rotated left, opening the gap in the left, closing down on the right side. Same thing on the other side. I should so close that stuff up. I'm having ridiculous symptoms. Hey, I know this stuff's symptomatic. I get out the reflex hammer. Reflexes, C5, C6, C7, were perfectly normal. We went to the wall and we did some thoracic spine, some single arm pendulum swings. The thoracic spine, frontal and transverse, leaning up against the wall, as a form of my nerve and upper limb tissue tension tests. And I went after a thoracic spine measurement, took my measurements and stuff like that. Although we have this, this right, top of my head, I think it's a right C-curve scoliosis. We went after the thoracic spine, no reproducible symptoms. We fixated the gaze first as we were going through our type 1 in sync and out of sync, and then our type 2 in sync and out of sync. No reproducible symptoms, but hey, just generally speaking, in my mid-back, that feels good. I'm like, hey, that's great. It should. Your mid-back is kind of moving like concrete. But again, no reproducible symptoms. And then when we went after, in terms of motion, creating more motion up and through the cervical spine via the thoracic spine without a fixated gaze, maybe an opposite direction motion with thoracic spine motion. No irritation or reproduction of any of these symptoms. Just maybe overall, hey, my arm's just getting a little tired. Significantly noticeable atrophy in both arms though. From all of this going on, which makes sense, but obviously too in terms of the weirdness of all of this, quite interesting. So my own rendition of my upper limb tissue tension test were all also normal. If there's a median, an ulnar, or radial nerve that was really ratcheted down, highly irritated, that in terms of winding things up would have really wound things up. We also went with some 3-point reaches to some 3-point rows, and then I just started going into some of my functional manual therapy as well. Fixated gaze or gaze moving. We actually started with head moving with the thoracic spine, so cervical and thoracic spine kind of traveling together, and then slowly worked on disassociating them more to see if we could really kind of crank things up a little bit. If there's ever some nerve or some facet joint syndrome and degenerative changes, that can be some pretty nasty stuff. So we wanted to not necessarily flare things up right off the bat, but we really wanted to try to reproduce stuff. And so conventional assessments and stuff like that, I went through my median, my ulnar, my radial nerve, upper limb tissue tension test, ran my MMT test. There's generalized weakness in both arms, weaker than what he's certainly accustomed to. Our grips, all sensation dermatomes were all normal, the sharp and the dull testing sensation as well. We had some C7 and some T1 weakness on the right and the left side. The right greater than the left, and so in terms of some evidence and in terms of what we were gathering, also went up to the cervical spine. So some things assessment-wise that's pretty conventional with regards to the cervical spine are the quadrant test, and then a little compression test and a little Sperling's test. So really, just basically taking the head, pushing it down, taking it to the side, and extending it, and then also rotating it, and applying a little compressive force to basically, and with some side bend, just basically see if we can't close up those neural foramina and close up on that nerve root itself and reproduce symptoms. And much to my surprise with all this stuff, or not to my surprise I should say, was that out of all of these best exam findings, there was not one thing that was positive for anything pertaining to cervical spine radiculopathy. In terms of our carpal tunnel, yes, can there be some night pain involved? 100% with carpal tunnel syndrome. In terms of our upper limb tissue tension test, we need to have a positive indicative factor of that, of the median nerve. The flexor retinaculum, which goes over the median nerve, the flexor digitorum superficialis, flexor digitorum profundus tendons, flexor pollicis longus. There's 10 structures that travel on down through that flexor retinaculum, which makes up the carpal tunnel, if you will. And in terms of mobility of the proximal and the distal row of bones in the hand, if you will, mobility is fine. Sometimes we can find maybe a lunate bone that's maybe a little bit out of displacement. Maybe we can find some flexor common mass. It's a little bit restricted and a little bit kind of bound up and a little bit gunky. No reproducible symptoms for tenderness to touch with carpal tunnel. You're obviously some grip strength and some forearm related weaknesses. We certainly had a little forearm and grip strength kind of related weakness, but generally speaking, both sides of the body with no reproducible symptoms with, again, the upper limb tissue tests. And then pertaining to lengthening in terms of eccentric control, in terms of what we do at the elbow and the shoulder, the hand and the wrist, eccentrically loading these things three-dimensional with what we did with our hand on the wall for our type 1 and type 2 thoracic spine stuff, and then our three-dimensional pendulum swings with lunges, weight bearing on the wall, and with our three-point reaches and rows off the wall as well, with an R and an LXX like position, and an E and I as well, to go after reproducing those symptoms and through the factor of loadability. None of that stuff was positive at all. So when I sent my dad up to his primary care physician, we weren't quite done, but I said, Dad, you need to let your primary care doc know that, hey, my son's unable to reproduce any of these symptoms. Hey, first tell him what I do, but tell him we have just a little bit to go, and it's more just going to be home exercise program for your thoracic spine and yet your hips. Your thoracic spine isn't moving very well. Do you have some degenerative changes in your cervical spine? I would assume so. You're 61 years old. You've been doing this since you've been 17. Tons of hard physical labor, and looking at the state of your thoracic spine, which is pretty matted down. Right glenohumeral joint capsule, pretty restricted as well on the inferior portion, which is limiting kind of any overhead-like activity. So it was basically, for the most part, the rest of the time I was going to spend with him setting him up with some things that he could do at home, but nothing was reproducible at all. Nothing this whole entire time. Goes to his primary care doctor, and at the end said, okay, doc, so, you're well aware of what I have going on and everything like that. My son, when I saw him and when I've been talking to him over this whole process, you know how we've chatted before, he's still saying, Dad, you're resembling the effects of what cancer would look like. And the response that my dad got back after kind of laughing about it, his primary care doctor laughed about it and said, no, you don't have cancer. This takes us through that day in the middle of July 2015. I think it was around like the 10th or the 12th. And we're now going to head into another episode 6, in which we're digging into